I didn't plan to go back to the ocean. I told myself that 1,000 times as I packed the duffel bag on a rain-streaked morning in Charleston, with the gulls wailing like an argument above the harbor and the salt already tasting like memory on my tongue. But names have a gravity of their own, and his, Mark Sullivan, pulled harder than any promise I had made to stay away. I told everyone he was the reason. The missing man, the headline, the scandal that boiled over into quiet at family dinners. The truth was thinner and colder. I went because the thing I couldn't name lived on that map, in that ragged triangle of myth and radios gone silent. And somewhere inside me I kept hearing his voice say, "Come find the answers, Em." I say we sometimes, like I'm part of something bigger. But the voyage started with one woman and a plane ticket I bought with my credit card at 2 a.m., when grief and stubbornness were at war and stubbornness was winning. I rented a small research boat through a broker with a name like Salt and a handshake like a transaction. Captain Reyes met me at the dock with a pack of cigarettes his doctor warned him about, and a smile that said he had seen worse and still chose to go. He asked me twice why I wanted to cross into the Bermuda Triangle. I gave him Mark's name and the trembling, practiced facts I had rehearsed for months. Mark disappeared. He was a surveyor for a private maritime firm. His last transmission hinted at something they'd found. The company called it a containment failure, and then called the lawyers. He didn't laugh. He squinted at me like he was weighing the story against the storm. Then he said, "You know what that place does, girl?" and lit a cigarette like lighting a prayer. I knew that answer well. The ocean there takes things and questions the reasons. But I had my own reasons for being stubborn. I also had a map he had drawn by hand in the last photo he sent me. A money-stained napkin of coordinates and a shaky arrow pointing to nowhere. Mark and I had been an old kind of love, the kind built on late-night astronomy classes and cheap coffee, on arguing gently about who left the toothbrush where. He was not the hero of the internet's imagination. He was not a myth-maker. He was a man who loved precision, a surveyor who measured the world to feel less adrift. When he told me the triangle had a pattern, he spoke like a man with a calculator against the dark, like someone who believed randomness could be read. I believed him because I loved him. I hated that I believed him also, because I wasn't sure love was enough to argue with gravity and legend. We set sail under a sky that bruised into evening. Captain Reyes's crew was a patchwork of faces. Anna, who could read sonar like a mother reads the mood of a baby. Miguel, who kept the engine from whining in the cold. And a boy named Eli, who pretended to be older than his fingers let on. They accepted me as quietly as you accept a new weather forecast, with the unspoken rule that the sea was boss. We moved out beyond the bank of shipping lanes, past the islands where the tourists were still laughing with their plastic cups, until the map turned into open breathing space and the GPS numbers began to mean less than the direction of the wind. The first night we passed, I woke to the sound of the ocean rubbing itself raw against the hull. It sounded like fingernails on bone. I stood on the deck, wrapped in a thrift store jacket, and watched light divide into miles. The stars were honest that night, stabbing and clear, and for a sliver of time, I felt something like peace. Mark's last text had been clipped, a string of coordinates and a smiley face that, read now, had the ache of a premonition. I swallowed it down and kept walking the deck. We found the disturbance when the instruments first refused to behave. Anna's console started throwing curves that shouldn't exist. The sonar readouts, usually obedient as a dog, began to tilt into shapes like distant mountains underwater. Miguel muttered into his sleeve. The compass did what it wanted, quick-stepping like a nervous bird. Captain Reyes swore softly and asked Anna to run the sweep again. She didn't say much. She just ran it and rewound it like someone rereading a sentence to make sure they'd seen it right. The lines on the screen folded into a pattern that crawled under my skin. Concentric spirals, almost floral, a design that did not belong to the map makers. My pulse began its own drum solo. I wanted to say stop. I wanted to say go home. Instead, I said, What do you make of that? Because asking not to look was a different kind of confession. Anna tapped and pointed and said, "No known geological structure, not an eddy, not man-made. It's anomalous." Her face had gone smaller in the light. That word lodged between us like a cold stone. The ship's radio, meanwhile, began to crackle with voices that weren't there. Static, then a faint voice that could have been weather or memory. I pressed my palm to the rail and felt the wood bleed the night air. The crew tightened. Words like superstition and legend were traded in low tones that didn't belong in the same breath as the instruments. I had never believed in the supernatural, but I'd also never believed in losing a person to silence that smelled like a burned fuse. Mark had been swallowed by that silence. It was a puzzle and a wound. I wanted to stitch them both. We dropped the anchor where the instruments bowed to the pattern. The water sucked at the anchor with a soft, hungry sound, as if the ocean wanted to keep what we were about to offer. Captain Reyes, who had lived around water his whole life, had a set of old superstitions he muttered while he worked. He said them like set prayers, names of saints and the odd cuss word. I said one prayer of my own, and then the boat hummed as if in reply. At dawn, the sea was a different animal, calmer but deceptive in its gentleness. The anomaly showed itself just beneath the surface like a scar. We lowered the submersible, a cramped sphere that smelled of metal and old electronics, and I climbed in because there was no one else who would carry the weight of wanting like I did. Eli's hands shook while he secured the hatch. Anna's fingers flew across the console with a surgeon's steadiness. Captain Reyes watched me climb down like he was watching something precious be offered to a god who might not return it. The descent was slow. The world narrowed to glass and pressure gauges and the mechanical breath of the submersible. The sunlight strangled itself as we sank, and the ocean turned from blue to the depth of bruises. My breath sounded too loud. I thought of Mark's hands, rough with calluses, and how he'd once taught me to tie knots that would not fail. I thought of the last time I saw him alive, how he smiled with a secret tucked behind it, and how secrets have a way of growing teeth. Below, the water held its own light, a phosphorescence that made the submersible glow like an insect trapped in glass. The instruments pinged and then pinged again, and the shapes on the screen resolved into something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Rows of sharp-edged ridges running like ribs along the seabed, and between them, the pattern we had seen from above, spirals that threaded through the sediment like a fingerprint. We hovered over one of the spirals, and a current breathed against the hull. It wasn't cold, it was precise, like someone turning a dial. The camera light picked out fragments embedded in the sediment. A piece of painted metal, a strip of cloth, an old watch face. I saw something that made the stomach knot of grief flip into ice. Handwriting on a rusted plate, half buried. A name I recognized in the way you recognize a face in a crowd. Mark. My vision tunneled. Anna's voice came through the speaker, clipped and professional. "We have debris, multiple signatures, potential human-made artifacts." I couldn't trust the light. I couldn't trust the instruments, but I could trust the pull in my chest that told me he had been close. I told the pilot to lower the manipulator arm. The claw descended like a question mark. It grazed the sediment and came up with a small metal cylinder, encrusted and tired. Inside, a roll of paper wrapped in oilcloth. I unwrapped it with fingers that remembered the neatness of Mark's hands. The paper was damp and smeared, but someone had written in a scrawl I knew like a scar. Eli? Or M? The letters were smudged. My breath moved in shallow pulls. Captain Reyes asked if I wanted it brought aboard. I said yes, but my voice was thin. We were close to something, and closeness felt like a threat. Back on the deck, with the sun like judgment on our faces, I opened the cylinder properly. The paper unfurled like a small surrender. The words were short, punctuated with numbers and fatigue, coordinates, measurements, a note about magnetic anomalies, and then This was the part that turned my mouth to gravel. It's not a natural formation. It behaves. The last line, in a hand I could pick out even when the ink blurred, read, "If I'm gone, look here. M." That was the kind of breadcrumb that both heals and kills. I read it 3 times until the letters blurred. It behaves. That phrase lodged in me like a splinter. Behaves how? Like a mind or like a machine? My head filled with models Mark would have loved. Tides, eddies, ferrous deposits, electromagnetic anomalies. Then an image that had nothing to do with science popped behind my ribs. A circle of light opening like a mouth. My first microhook arrived as the radio, which had been dead all morning, began to play a tone that matched nothing in the usual nautical catalog. It was low and melodic, a pattern like the spirals below us. The crew fell quiet. Anna's hands hovered over the console as if over a wound. Captain Reyes's cigarette burned down to nothing. Eli moved like he'd been struck. I felt the hair on the back of my neck lift in little, terrified salute. The sound threaded through the air and then cut. Then a voice, far and thin as if through glass, whispered a single word. Emily. I don't know how to explain the way the world narrowed to that syllable. It wasn't Mark's voice. It couldn't be. But it carried the shape of him. The crew looked at me like they were watching an omen take a step. I did what I had always done. I put one foot in front of the other and reached for what I needed to know. We prepared to dive again, deeper and with more instruments this time. I could feel the crew's hesitation like a physical thing pressing against my back. Captain Reyes asked if I was sure. Each time he asked, I had to peel my certainty off like an old bandage and present it to him clean. I'm sure, I said, which was true in the only way that mattered. I could not let fear dictate the final map of Mark's life. As the submersible descended, I pressed my forehead to the glass, watching the light shrink and the shapes take on a geometry that did not belong to natural formation. The ascetic lines, the spirals threading like DNA, the artifacts, they all stared back at me as if waiting for an answer. I thought of Mark saying, "Patterns are the only language left when everything else goes quiet." There, in the pressurized dark, I felt the language he had loved. I felt close enough to touch it. I felt the world tilt. And then the lights flickered. The lights flickered once, then again, like the submersible was trying to blink awake inside the crushing dark. I steadied my breath, pressing my palms flat against the console, as if my touch could anchor the machine. Everything inside me wound tight, not with fear alone, but with the sense that I was stepping into the part of the story that had always existed, waiting for me to finally arrive. The depth gauge ticked downward. The water outside was no longer water, but a moving shadow, thick and deliberate. And then, a glow. Subtle at first, a wash of silver drifting across the window like distant lightning. Then it brightened into braided strands, spirals weaving themselves in perfect loops. The same formation we'd seen earlier, but now alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. "It's responding to us," I breathed. Anna's voice cracked over the comms. "Emily, readings are off the charts. You don't have much time." But time had never been my ally, and I wasn't here for caution. I was here for truth. We drifted lower until the spirals opened into a clearing on the seabed, a circle of shimmering particles spinning around a sunken mass. Not a ship, not debris, something built. Its edges were too clean, its curves too deliberate. A structure half buried in silt, like a cathedral someone had lowered into the ocean centuries ago. At its center, a pale light flickered like a dying star. My breath hitched. "Mark, were you here?" I guided the sub closer. A current pushed back, not violently, but almost gently, as if warning or testing. The sub vibrated. The light inside the structure pulsed once, twice, and then a soft tone filled the cabin. A tone I knew. a tone I had heard playing on Mark's phone on the night before his disappearance. Some half-composed melody he'd been working on, something he called Homeward. My heart collapsed in on itself. "That can't be real," I whispered, but the melody kept playing, as if someone deep below was touching the same notes he used to hum into my hair. Then the radio crackled, static first, like sandpaper dragged across steel. Then a voice pushed through, submerged and strained, a voice that carried the shape of memory, the shape of him. "M?" My lungs forgot how to work. "Mark? Mark, is that you?" The voice wavered, disintegrating and reforming. "Don't. Come closer. It reacts." The cabin temperature dropped so sharply I felt it in my teeth. I pushed closer anyway. "No," I whispered fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." The spirals brightened in response, threads of light cascading upward like the ocean itself was awakening. The sub bucked, not violently, but insistently. The instruments screamed. Pressure alarms erupted in sharp, panicked bursts. Anna yelled through the comms, frantic. "Emily, pull back! The field is destabilizing! You're going to collapse the hull!" But something else happened then. The light from the structure arced upward and wrapped around the sub, not crushing, but holding, supporting, as if it recognized something in the metal, or in me. The vibrations smoothed. The alarms cut out. The water grew still. And then, through the glow, I saw him. Not alive, not floating, but sitting on the ocean floor, helmet cracked, body still, head bowed forward. Mark. I covered my mouth as the world shattered around me in silence. "No. No, please." The structure, the spirals, the light, they dimmed with my grief, softening like they understood. I forced myself to look, to see him. His suit was tangled in the formation's ridges, like he had been reaching toward the entrance when everything fell apart. His helmet visor was smashed inward, but the look on what remained of his face wasn't fear. It was peace, acceptance, like he'd understood something at the end. I pressed my forehead to the glass, tears falling hard enough to sting. "I'm here," I whispered. "I found you. I'm sorry it took so long." The melody, his melody, began again, softer this time. The spirals reacted with a slow, luminous sway, a pattern so gentle it hurt. For a moment I wondered if the formation had tried to warn him, or tried to hold him, or tried to speak. Whatever it wasn't evil. It wasn't malicious. It was simply unknown, and he had gotten too close. "M?" the radio whispered again. Not his voice, not really, but some echo carried in the distortion of the magnetic field, a trapped resonance of his last transmission. I let the sound wash over me like a goodbye. "I came for answers," I said softly, but all I really wanted was the truth. The structure flickered one last time, as if offering something like a bow. The spirals dimmed. The current released the sub. It was time. With a final look, one I knew would hollow me out for years, I guided the sub upward. The ocean darkened behind us. The melody faded. The pressure shifted from crushing to lifting, and I felt something inside me break and reshape all at once. Hours later, when I reached the surface, the crew read the truth in my eyes before I spoke. Captain Reyes removed his hat. Anna covered her lips. Eli cried openly. I simply held the small metal cylinder, the last thing he left me, and felt its weight like a vow. On the journey back to shore, I barely slept. When I did, I dreamt of spirals turning like slow galaxies, and of Mark smiling the way he used to when I solved a puzzle before him. I dreamt of peace settling over him like sunlight. When Charleston's harbor lights came into view, I stepped onto the dock and felt the hard, unmoving ground beneath me. The world hadn't changed, but I had. My grief no longer drifted without anchor. It pointed somewhere now. Toward memory, toward closure, toward the truth he died trying to chase. Months later, when I submitted the final report to the Maritime Board, I wrote the simple truth. The Bermuda Formation is not a monster. It is a phenomenon we do not yet understand. It behaves, yes, but not with hunger, with pattern. I kept one sentence for myself alone. He wasn't lost. He was found by the only person who could carry him home. Some nights, when the wind hums through my windows, I still hear that soft melody, his melody, floating like a thin thread of light between worlds. And I whisper into the dark, I remember. Not to summon him, but to promise that I will never forget the man who measured the world, who believed that patterns were the only language left when everything else went quiet. And in the end, that language brought me back to him. The ocean kept many secrets, but it returned one truth. Mark died searching for meaning. I lived to carry it. And that, in the quietest, deepest part of me, was enough.